Thank you. Thanks, Jason. Yeah, welcome to Trajectory Labs. If you haven't been here before, we are a nonprofit organization that is interested in making sure that AI goes well for humanity, and we provide various types of support to AI safety and related researchers. And we also put on events like this to encourage more people to get involved in the field and tackle some of the biggest challenges coming from AI. If it's your first time here, if you need to use the washrooms, just go out the glass doors there, and you can use the keypad to get back in. And without further ado, I'm going to pass things off to Ajay, who's going to be taking us through the China AI Action Plan. So a big round of applause for Ajay.
Thank you. All right, that's pressure because now I got to make sure I earned that applause. And yeah, making sure that AI goes well. Who's really going to decide how that happens? I think that's part of what we're here to look at. I mean, very often, just by virtue of where we sit, and I'm speaking in broad terms, I know there are folks here who have different specialties and different expertise, but we tend to take a pretty, we focus mostly kind of on what's happening, let's say, what's coming out of the US, and at least in our media for sure, and our media consumption. And again, I know that some of us make kind of a concerted effort to see both sides of the story. But it's interesting, like right off the bat, just as I started to dig into this, you see how, depending on where you read, you hear something different. So it is very helpful to get, independent sources. Anyways, all that to say, this was new to me, and I actually appreciate and thank Trajectory for asking me to take this on because it was very educational for me. A couple of weeks ago, we looked at the US AI Action Plan just a few days after it came out. And pretty much, I think like on that day or a few days after this, China released a plan. I kind of call it an action plan here. That's what it's being called in broad terms. As we dig into it a little bit more, we'll see there's probably some more context we should look at before looking at that document, and realizing that it's not so much an action plan as a call to action, and just more a general kind of tone setting as to how China would like to see the world move forward with respect to AI development, AI governance, AI safety. They kind of cover the full gamut. Not terribly different from the US AI Action Plan. They just do it in, I think, like 1/6 the amount of pages, and with far less political rhetoric, which was actually surprising. All right, so let's dig into it. So it was unveiled at the 2025 World AI Conference, and you don't have to read all this, but the point of this was just to say these are the preambles. So the preamble down here was from the US AI Action Plan, and the top here was from the announcement at the World AI Conference. And the reason I just put these up was not to have you read a whole page of text, was just to point out a couple quick things, just so you could see the difference in tone right off the bat. So from the World AI Conference in Shanghai, we see that, AI represents a new frontier for human development, a driving force that they see as something that can drive the international public good and benefits to humanity. Let's take the first sentence of the American plan. America's in a race to achieve global dominance. Like, that's just the first thing that they go with. In fact, the USAA Action Plan subtext is winning the race. So just right off the bat, a very, very different tone. And the reason why I'll spend just a little bit of time setting some context is the way this kind of got positioned right in the media, generally speaking, was that this was a reaction to the US. It's worth noting that the World AI Conference was planned long before this. It's also very likely that these announcements were planned long before this. I don't doubt that perhaps there were some last-minute, late-night adjustments before they made the announcement in response to the US. But this is not something that was done just in response. So as we mentioned, a few days after, so the USAA Action Plan was July 23rd, and this was revealed on July 26th by the Chinese premier at the keynote at this conference. And just to give some kind of sense of how important that was, there was more than 1,000 attendees from across the world, which included names like Jeffrey Hinton and Yoshua Bengio. And these were some of the people at the plenary sessions and panels that took place outside of what you might call like an expo. So sorry to lay a little more detail there. There were kind of two sections to this conference. One was more like a trade show. The other was a set of plenary sessions in a separate building and forums on topics that would be close to our heart, like safety and control. As I kind of mentioned, the US plan was 28 pages. This was 5. They're a lot more succinct. They're both just as fluffy. Despite the US kind of trying to sound a lot more official, a lot of it is just saying things and not necessarily having the buy-in from the respective organizations. They were a lot more just kind of, I guess, honest about the fact that, hey, this is what we'd like to do. They didn't sign everybody up for it because they're not necessarily signed up yet. But it's basically goes across 12 different principles that are mostly focused on innovation, unsurprisingly, open sharing, which was a really promising thing to see and reflective actually of the US approach as well. Sorry, not reflective, but similar to the US approach as well. There's a focus on diversity and inclusion and benefits to humanity, which is really reassuring again. There's a very direct focus also on climate and, green computing and sustainable practices and sharing those best practices, and very much just an overtone of collaboration and cooperation, which that's why I kind of wanted to show you right at the bat, just the opening piece to both of those plans are very, very different with how they start off from the top. All right. So again, kind of setting some context here, I came across a really, really helpful, first it was a podcast and then it was a paper on kind of the AI policy eras in China. And it's helpful because it helps you kind of understand where we are today. And again, apologies to those that are already well versed in this. I think for most of us, maybe this is at least a little new, just seeing it this way. But this is why I also wanted to mention that, they called it an action plan. The truth is China actually had an national AI development plan back in 2017, quite a comprehensive one and a very aggressive one. And this is at a time where, GDP was strong, growth was strong, there was high confidence. This actually comes from a scholar, and I'm sorry, I should have put his name, but there are links. I think you guys put the slides out after, right? So there are links to okay, good, they do. So there are links to the papers and stuff that I used for this. But from an excellent scholar who kind of just points out that there's this correlation that between, where China perceives itself as vulnerable, they lean on economic progress and development to move forward. When they feel strong, that's when the state kind of gets a little bit more aggressive with its approach to control and conformity. And as they put it here, they get a little bit more heavy-handed with ideological measures. And so back in 2017, when they actually first released the National AI Development Plan, which had a horizon up until 2030, which very much saw China wanting to be a world leader in AI, everything, capacity, development, governance, investment was high. Then we kind of got to like a crackdown era. You guys would probably remember better than me. If you're in tech, there was kind of the whole Jack Ma thing, and then he got slapped really hard by the Chinese government. And that actually was just the precursor to this whole era where, they felt strong. Things were good. They thought they were kind of ahead of everybody when it came to AI, or at the very least leading the pack as well. And then COVID hit. There was some very strong economic weakness. There was massive unemployment across the board. And so they didn't feel so strong anymore. And they started to get a little bit more flexible again in terms of their regulation and what they were willing to do. This was kind of the time when generative AI was becoming a little bit more to the fore, and where they had initially, out of this era, come out with some very strict generative AI requirements. They softened up. And now they're at a crossroads where DeepSeek was released, and they realized that with far less, adequate technology, they could still produce amazing results. And so now there's this confusion. It's do they want to lead? Can they lead? Can they still do that with the export controls that are being put on them in terms of chips? But clearly there's a tone in this document that you'll see that they at the very least want to play a leading role. They're not necessarily saying we have to be number one, but they definitely want to play a leading role. And there's definitely strong undertones of how they continue to not just proliferate, but also kind of maintain their soft power in the world. So just digging quickly into these eras, that first kind of go-go era, we talk about, the National AI Development Plan led out of the Ministry of Science and Technology. And pretty stark numbers there. Chinese AI equity investment reached 40% of the global total. that's half of all investment. In 2017, annual GDP growth of 6.5%. For context there, in developed economies at the very least, 1%, 2% a good year. 6.5 is blistering speed for an economy that size. And there was rapid development and not a whole ton of overburdening control. And that was the tone. And then there was the crackdown era that we just talked about recently. And so, as the country felt strong, growth was good, things were moving fast, they felt like, what, we can crack down a little bit harder, get some more conformity, because it was a little bit like the Wild West too. There were, I don't remember specific incidents, but there were incidents where, Chinese companies had actually pushed back on requests from the government for data or to breach customer privacy. And they would say no. You can't really imagine that in today's world, or maybe sometimes with the image that's portrayed, but that used to happen. And then the Cyberspace Administration of China, which I heard termed as one of the most kind of hard ass agencies out there, really came hard and slapped people down. But at the same time, you also had zero COVID, which was very, very hard on their economy. And so that actually acted as a bit of a stifling on their development and on their progress in AI. And so they were caught off guard when ChatGPT came out, and they realized they weren't nearly as far ahead as they probably thought they were. And this is where I was mentioning earlier. There kind of were these interim measures on generative artificial intelligence, just basic security requirements, which initially were they were kind of crazy. Like when I was reading some of the papers, they were saying like everything has to be truthful, all the training data has to be accurate and fair and unbiased, and it's just like insane things that are just not possible. Certainly not 3 years ago. But when they realized just how far behind they really were, all of a sudden they're like, you know what? Okay, maybe we take a step back. We stop stifling innovation here. We give them a chance to grow and run, and seemed to kind of worked, because even with VC investments still falling off a cliff essentially, DeepSeek still came out and shook the world, right, and showed what could be done, even in the absence of the world-class technology that's coming out of the U.S., much of which these companies don't have access to. So before I go any further, I'll just take a quick pause, see if there's any questions. Making sense so far? Yes, I see nods. That's good. Cool. So, yep. I have a laser pointer I can use. Oh, wow. Cool. Cool. Anyways, I was going to go down memory lane there when I was a kid. The little cheap ones you could buy from the dollar store. But live off that stuff. Anyways, World AI Conference. That brings us till today. So as we were mentioning, over 40 countries, international organizations attend the World AI Conference in Shanghai. And this is like which now, you know what? I'm connecting the dots. Like, very interesting time for the US to announce their AI action plan. Can't believe I went through all this and didn't even put that together. So they announced it right as this is happening. But it's interesting that, for this, their hope was that they chat about a couple of things, innovation. Again, we always kind of hear innovation. That's great. But there's 3 things they want to talk about. One of them is promoting inclusive development and bridging the digital divide. That's not something you hear coming out of the US at all. Strengthening collaborative governance and ensuring AI for good. Again, I get it. These are just words, and a lot of it's kind of like political statements, but at least that's what they're saying, which again, usually you would have expected it to be the other way around. Not at all. And then, the premier himself calling for a formation of a global AI governance framework. For context and contrast, in the US AI action plan, they were basically deriding all the multilateral organizations and global cooperation, and kind of wanted to go a more plurilateral route, meaning just working with countries that they want to work with, who are allies and not adversaries, versus China just saying, hey, like, can we just get together and solve these global problems that clearly don't know any borders? Yes, question. Mm-hmm. Buy time for what though? I think that's an interesting question, but what I would say to that is, I think they're pragmatic enough to know that the U.S. is not going to hold their hand. They're very much in an arms race, and they know that. So I think what I feel coming out of them, and we'll see that as we kind of go through the rest, but it feels a little bit like they're trying to sidestep the U.S. Like the U.S. is trying to get in their face and say, we're in a race and we're going to fight you. And they're like, well, there's the rest of the world too. And I don't know why, like, 6 pages of your 28-page plan are about China, which literally there are things that just call out China. Like, China cannot be part of international governance forums. They cannot lead. Like, it's just so specific to them. All that to say is, there's no way China doesn't realize, like, yeah, we're definitely not going to hold hands and walk off into the sunset. But I think what they're trying to do is seize the moment, because the U.S. is more or less, I didn't write that because I know these slides go out, but they're more or less abdicating their role in global governance and global leadership. And they're taking that moment in that power vacuum, I think, to increase their soft power. And why not? Because the administration you would expect to be saying things like this and having that global leadership role is, in that plan itself, openly abdicating it. So anyways, does that kind of help? All right. So let's kind of jump into it. And I thought we'd walk through it together. Just because, again, I think it's new to most of us. It was new to me, that's for sure. But you'll see a similar tone right off the bat, which is as much as the US plan seemed a lot more detailed and it had lots of words, they're basically just saying, at a similar level of fluffiness, this is what we'd like to do. Because it's kind of what the US says too. This is what we'd like to do. They are not actually, can't actually make anybody do anything. And they don't necessarily have buy-in from other agencies to do it either. So their first principle here is just jointly seize the opportunities of AI. This is what I said. It's kind of fluffy, it's out there, but at least right off the bat, they start with let's do it as a joint development. And one thing I really did appreciate was that right off the bat, they focus on, existing international commitments and forums, namely the UN, and saying that AI should be used to help implement the 2030 UN Sustainable Development Goals. And just kind of at a super succinct level, all that really is about is alleviating human suffering, and especially through poverty. And of course, you'd imagine there's like hundreds of pages of reports and metrics and objectives, but that's effectively what it's about. But most importantly, not a single tone of that came through in the US plan. Nothing about it was about alleviating poverty or helping the global south right from the start. And that's kind of been China's play for a long time, right? Through the Belt and Road Initiative and other things like that, where, hey, like the US is going to lead these countries that many of which they've kind of, put in that position. But aside from that, they're like, hey, we'll help you develop. We know what it's like. In fact, I'll even give you a personal example, like where my family's from, which is Guyana in South America. The U.S. had quite a interesting role to play over the years politically. But even right now, like the U.S. is extracting oil, but it's the Chinese who are actually building infrastructure, roads, bridges, schools, hospitals. That's how they increase their soft power. And it's because they know what it's like to be in a developed economy. And they kind of want to capitalize on that. So yeah, this is, if you want to take a look at it later, just wanted to give you a sense of what the sustainable development goals are, just so you understand that, they're talking about things like end hunger and no poverty and good health and education. So things for the world. Yes, question. As in who's adopting China's? I personally can't give you like a list of countries, but what I would say is I would assume two things. One, those who are using Chinese technology, Chinese technology and Chinese infrastructure, which is a lot of the developing world. How much of that is their digital infrastructure? I honestly don't know. A lot of times that's kind of like real infrastructure, like roads, bridges, airports, that kind of stuff. I would expect that's one. And two, those who are politically aligned with China, right? But closer to being politically aligned with China than anything else. I honestly don't have a view on that. Happy to hear from the audience. I know we have some experts on geopolitics here, but I wouldn't be able to name countries right off the bat. And I think that's also primarily because, and that's why I stated first, like, what systems are you on? What infrastructure are you using, specifically digital infrastructure? Because that probably has a bigger role to play. Because as much as there might be countries that are more heavily aligned with China in terms of their real infrastructure, and geopolitically, they might use all American software and all American, maybe even hardware too. So that's why I said that was a little complicated. I couldn't really get a sense of it, even through all the reading that I did. They don't actually really say who's in their sphere of influence. I think that's what they're trying to create, because they have it in a real way. They have it in like a military way, right? They have it in that actual like geographic kind of alliances, but I don't really have a good sense of where their sphere of influence is in terms of the digital world. And I think that's actually probably what they're trying to put some lines around here and see who will show up. And that was their first hint. I mean, as far as I read, that was Jeffrey Hinton's first visit to China. So, I mean, that's pretty momentous. That's a clear shift, right? Two is promote the innovative development. I won't bore you with this. Like everybody says, yes, let's innovate. Yes, that's what AI is. But definitely a focus on openness and sharing, international cooperation and creating platforms for that. Strengthening policy and regulatory coordination, which was good to see. And again, for contrast, in the US, regulation was referred to as burdensome and onerous and problematic, and that it needs to be cut. You do not hear that here. And promoting breakthroughs in AI, that's pretty straightforward. And then we go to empowering industry, which again, kind of unsurprising, but a very real thing, definitely in China, which is just a blistering economic engine, and the speed at which they can move when they're actually ready and they have a focus. And so, excuse me, to accelerate that, and that's usually what AI is kind of seen as a catalyst or an accelerator, sorry. That's what they're hoping to do here as well. So empowering their major industries, unsurprisingly, building a rich and diverse ecosystem. Again, I know these are just very fluffy words, but I stress them because it's a real difference in tone from the US plan. And engaging in cross-border cooperation. So again, no very very specific policy actions here, and this is where you contrast with the US plan, where they do talk about specific policy actions, but even that still is just fluff, because a lot of it is just they're saying things and no one's necessarily bought in, and a lot of it's a huge departure from how some of those agencies have operated in the past. A clear kind of example of that would have been, calling out what the National Institute of Standards and Technology should do, and then saying that they need to remove like climate and DEI dogma from their risk frameworks, which this is where I'm saying, like, as much as the US said a lot more specific things, how feasible they actually are, how much buy-in there is about the same as this. If anything less, because at least they were doing this at a conference that included people from across the world. So walking a bit of the talk. Similar to the US, they do talk about developing infrastructure, particularly digital infrastructure, and that means things like, data centers, the electrical grid that actually will supply this. But they do actually call it right off the bat, when they're talking about infrastructure, clean electricity. And again, to contrast with the US plan, their whole focus on building energy was about, we need to cut climate regulation, we need to speed run the approval process, which by the way has already been like wildly underfunded and undercut. And so let's make it even weaker so we can build even faster, including on federal lands. Whereas their stress is like, hey, let's focus on clean, which I know the flip side to that is coal power generation and blah, blah, blah. But hey, at least they're saying it. It doesn't sound like they're planning to regress. They're focused on certainly on interoperability, but really was heartening to see this focus on helping the global south. So whereas the US plan was just focused on America first, like that's the whole thing, right? This actually talks about, hey, not just cooperation for the sake of our, furthering, but helping the developing world that is in a position that we were once in. So maybe I'll just take a quick pause before I go to the next slide. Comments, questions? No? What? Yeah. Whether there's parallels between them trying to fill that gap. Yeah, I would see that as almost a completely analogous. Like they're using exactly that. And that's where we kind of talked about earlier, some of those countries where the US themselves even played a role in putting those countries where they are economically, not necessarily a good place. That's exactly what China has done, is stepped in and said, well, we will help you develop and create your own so that you're able to sustain yourself. I mean, they're not silly. They also do build things in a way that there is clearly a long-term dependence, if at the very least just for defense capabilities or, maintenance. Like just simply maintain your infrastructure. Like if they built everything, you best believe the replacement parts are coming from China too. So they're not silly in that way, but it is very much because there was a need, right? I mean, these countries were desperate for someone to just like help us along the way. And then of course that then gets termed as, well, China's buying and selling these countries and blah blah blah. So yes. Yeah.
do that, which is the middle of the North Atlantic, and needs to run completely on oil, like my foot needs to make. Because if you let Bermuda do what it wants to do, it would be running on renewable energy. So I see the potential for China becoming an economic hitman, but that's not necessarily what's going on. But it is something that kind of brings the opposite of that.
The gist of this is very good wording. I'm glad I'm saying this because certainly the EU resonates with the whole Canada. We all
Yeah. Paper. They're talking about it. Right. Right. And they're not necessarily in the business of wanting to embarrass themselves, right? I mean, they brought the foremost minds and luminaries in AI and diplomats to come and see this and hear this. And if it was domestic, like I wouldn't put a ton of stock in it. They could do whatever they want at home, right? But they're talking to the world right now. And I mean, fair point. But hey, let's not even get into the U.S.'s bloodstained history, right? So, and that continues until today. And I'm assuming you're talking about the Cultural Revolution, right? Which was a different time. This is a different China, and to the extent that many of those generations aren't even here today, right? But all that to say is, yeah, I mean, fair point, fair considerations, but we go with that route, and then we also, and one thing I'd also say about U.S. influence is, one, they also made those countries dependent on their currency. All their debt was in that currency and had to be repaid that way. And even if it wasn't through them, if it was through the IMF or the World Bank, guess who runs them too? So you can't really escape. You couldn't have really escaped them. They also had a monopoly on many technologies, whereas again, that's not the same today, right? It's a different world, right? So I think those are important things to keep in mind. And let's also hope that a lot of those countries too, one, they don't necessarily have a choice. They have to choose somebody. Like somebody needs to help them. And two is they've probably already been burned once. And so ideally, assuming not an insane amount of corruption, which is wishful sometimes, that they wouldn't want to go that same path again and hopefully take their own approach to making sure that they're not overly dependent best they can. But that's where we are today. So, but good point. Thank you. Again, words that were taboo in the US, get rid of DEI. One of their principles, create diversity and open innovation. Same kind of tone of promoting international exchanges, but specifically on AI governance, making sure you're including government, industry, and academia, which, again, really, really heartening to see, building transnational open source communities. So this is actually something we saw in the US plan too. There was a big focus on open source, but the overall tone of the document made it seem like it was for something not different, but just much more focused on increasing and maintaining soft power, whereas theirs was just more so like, hey, like we should just like collaborate with the world. Like we're all facing some of these issues, so we should collaborate with them. But they know it's about, they know that it's, and in fact, I think, remember correctly, they've had more of sometimes of like an open source approach just to try and increase that soft power, make things available to people. Promoting inclusiveness and accessibility of AI tech. Again, super fluffy. Who knows what that even means, but not a word you'd even come close to finding in the US plan. And then moving to data. So again, nothing super surprising here, but did appreciate the fact, again, I don't know how they would do that, but eliminate discrimination and bias. At least they're thinking about it. Promoting and protecting and preserving diversity of the AI ecosystem. Not 100% sure what that meant, because they also said of human civilization as well. That was in the same sentence. I didn't just add that. Like, not 100% sure what that meant, but these words make me feel warm and fuzzy inside. So better than before. But I'll just keep going through. And yeah, so this is where, rubber kind of hits the road again, and was very, not surprised, but I'm glad that they took such a stark kind of contrast from the US approach and just said right off the bat, like, hey, there's clearly a need for sustainable approaches to developing this. They understand, I mean, them especially with the resource demands that they have, understand how much of an issue it can actually become. So they are promoting, green computing, energy and water efficiency, sustainability, and dialogue and cooperation, again, across borders, but about how we conserve resources in AI development and deployment. So So yeah, big focus on climate. Any questions, comments? Gonna keep going. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is there any kind of reason to believe any tactical action like behind the words? Like, is there kind of a history of these documents turning into something tangible, or is it more kind of just a general signal? How much of this translates into actual impact?
No, it is a hard question, but it's a very fair one. And sorry, we should have been doing this, but for the online audience, the question was, how much of this document do we actually expect to translate into real world impacts in the past? How have documents like this coming out of China translated into real world impacts? And the answer to that is, I think, just to make a distinction, I think domestically, right, because this is kind of like an international intention, right? Domestically, I think there's probably a better track record of like making these things happen. Like the National AI Development Plan, like it happened. They made it happen, right? And then they kind of sabotage themselves, but that's a different story. But even when they wanted to do that, sabotage themselves, they did it, right? And then they wanted to fix it, and they fixed it. So they clearly could do it domestically. Internationally, that I don't know. But what gave me some hope, and specifically on this topic, I genuinely don't know. And it kind of like I didn't feel too fuzzy, like too fuzzy about it, because I also know kind of China's track record, a little bit about China's track record when it comes to clean energy. But I'm more inclined to give the benefit of the doubt simply because they actually have walked the talk when it comes to AI regulation, AI safety, international collaboration more so. Like as they've said, they want to do more of that. They clearly have been doing more of that. How good it is, it's a different story. I'm not making a value judgment one way or the other, but they made that intention. They've clearly been doing it enough that they've brought some of the brightest and best people to have dialogue, and actually have them sign on to things. And I had a little example of that later. Actually sign on to things, commitments, right? Including Benju and Hinton about AI safety and governance. So that kind of at least bodes well that, hey, they can actually get people to buy in. That's why I try to make that distinction of domestically. Clearly, they can make it happen one way or the other. Internationally, time will tell, but there's a bit of a track record there that I saw. Yes.
What elements of this plan are reflected in like domestic speeches going forward, especially as like the level of the speaker gets higher, the more likely it is that to happen. So like you'll see what elements of this translates over domestically.
Right. No, great point. And for the online audience, we had a very smart comment there from the audience saying that, you'll see a good indicator would be the rhetoric that you see coming out of politicians or officials in China. And the more senior they are, the more kind of a commitment there probably is, implicit commitment there is to doing these things. And what probably bodes well is that this whole thing was announced by the premier to the whole world, right? So that's a good start. Yes, we got a couple more questions. Maybe could I just go to him first, just and then I'll come. Yep. Totally.
But I will say that it does create a degree of accountability.
Yeah, 100%.
That is written down, circulated, it's documented. These words are out there. So if they don't live up to these initiatives,
For whatever one may think about either administration, but we're talking about China, so talk about China. They are not fans of embarrassing themselves or being embarrassed. So that's why, again, I kind of give it a little bit of the benefit out simply because they had their premiere, get on the world stage in front of, the best and the brightest, in front of diplomats and say, this is what we want to do. And very clearly knowing that this is going to be a big deal because of what the US just said. And this is what I say, they're not in the business of embarrassing themselves. So that gives me a little bit of hope there, right? Even if just for the sake of pride, they're like, we got to do this. Who cares why you do it? Just do it. Right? The ends justifies the means. So principle number 8, which is promote consensus on standards and norms. Sorry, I lost my track there for a sec. Oh, actually, let me go back because that was very rude. You were going to ask a question. Let's go ahead. Yeah.
Everything here makes me wonder on the side of not the wrong bell, whether their comments and their about the dangers of AI, and it feels and it's already much more advanced than we think it is. I wonder if these comments, especially trying to promote some consensus in the international community, I wonder whether they know very well that AI is way ahead of what the US assumes it is right now. And they want to, by any means necessary, put a bulwark on it. I don't know. But I mean, if we're doing something as thoughtful as this, we're trying to recruit people to a cause, there must be some awareness, not just what do you think?
True. I will answer in one sec, just because the gentleman behind you, Wyatt, wants. Yeah, add to that.
That Xi Jinping, one of his top technical advisors on AI was for the generic lineup, being very concerned about safety. And there's a bit of wasn't entirely clear which side Xi Jinping was on. Basically, he certainly heard about the catastrophic risks that Ben is talking about, and I'm hoping that at least part of this is like, there's no way we can solve this on our own. We're gonna have to global governments. So might as well seize the moment and make America look bad. So yeah.
Yes. So for the online audience, to just make sure I'm capturing this correctly, like basically, how much is this really political rhetoric versus actual real intention to do these things?
But also, not just real intention, but is it broadcasting an awareness that the international community may not have at the moment?
Awareness about.
Awareness of how dangerous AI can become.
Oh, no, I didn't really hear that coming through here. I think they know, and in fact, they do know, and that was some of the other perspective that I came across too, which is they're very cognizant that the U.S. is ahead of them, and for that reason is far more likely to run into the emergent risks that come with AI. So they know that they're not leading the pack in that kind of way, right? They know that they're not telling anybody anything new. I think that's why their focus is more about how do we deal with those things. Is that helpful? Many more questions. Well, we have a Q&A at the end, so don't forget them. And so yeah, so promoting consensus on standards and norms, which, kind of to your very point, I think to some extent implicitly acknowledges that there are problems and we need to work together to solve them. And why don't we, instead of building new things that the US is suggesting, use existing fora, including things like ISO. They talked about the UN earlier. There's more names in there, but basically just using existing multilateral mechanisms for cooperation. And there is very much an actual focus on, technical standards in areas like safety and ethics. Again, not something you hear at all coming out of the U.S. plan, but they clearly know it's an issue. Hence why they brought these people to talk about these very specific things. Eliminating algorithmic bias. So again, just good things to see there. Risk prevention, social ethics. Again, the right words, fair points. How much of that will we really see? But again, this is an open commitment to the world and actually bringing people together to try and deal with them. And also, I should say, they want to establish agencies. Unsurprisingly, some of them based in Shanghai. But I think where the perspective probably needs to shift a little bit is like that shouldn't be a pejorative, right? Maybe we should just take a step back before we automatically assume that that's a pejorative, especially if, again, like the best and brightest are signing on and saying like, hey, maybe this is where we need to do this because they're running the most patents and they're doing some of the best innovation and the most quickly. So yeah, we have a question here. Who's paying?
Let's say they deploy their AI, then they're ahead of the curve like forever, probably because now they have access to their international data, which would stay secure for other technologies. So is this also like a plan to have that sustainable competitive advantage, stay top of the curve kind of forever by having everyone's data, everyone's kind of everything?
I would say it is definitely about sustaining a competitive advantage. More than a competitive advantage, I think it's more, which would be a function of also having the soft power in those countries, by having them adopt the technologies and the practices and the frameworks and everything else. Yeah, exactly. I mean, both things can be true. And I think that's what it is for them, right? Like, it's not that obviously they should win more, and that's any country is going to do that. You know, you put your national interest first, and that's what I say. I don't think we should necessarily look at it, and not that you are, but when we look at some of these things, not necessarily look at them as pejoratives. Like, that's naturally what a nation would probably seek to do. And so yeah, like, I mean, that's part of the trade-off, right? A lot of these companies could never actually repay them for a lot of what they've invested or given them, but they also, I mean, you hear the things, right? When the product's free, right, you're paying for it with your data. Yeah, exactly. So you're the product, and your data is also what they're looking for too. So similar kind of idea. But what's the alternative? You just don't develop. I mean, you stay in abject poverty. So like, that's kind of the flip side of, yep, question. Mm. Yeah. Yes. I think we'll save that for the breakout discussions. But Stephen, did you have a question? Or you're good? Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Like, it's just getting people on your particular system and getting familiar with that, and you build your infrastructure around it, you build your life around it, all your services around it, you become completely dependent on it. And it's the same with real infrastructure. That's why I said, if they build your roads and they build your airports and they sell you the shuttles and all the trucks and everything to do it too, then of course you're going to be dependent on that, right? So if you want to use GPT as some kind of an analogy, I mean, if who is not on Microsoft Office? Like, there's always that joke, like, if Excel ever failed, the whole financial system would crumble, which is true. Honest to God, it is. Like, having spent 10 years in banking, it's terrifying how true that is. Like, the world would fall apart if, and I've asked them, like, you have to do things like resiliency planning and crisis management and whatever. And you have like your different vendors, like, what's your backup plan and blah, blah, blah. And I remember asking one time during some of that stress testing, I'm like, so like, how come we never talk about IBM or Microsoft? They're like, just because, listen, man, like, if that happens, like, the world ended. Like, the government is done too. So just don't worry about that. I was like, duly noted. Um, so that's public sector should take the lead. Nothing surprising there. It actually calls all countries across the globe to do that, which, again, like, if you want to read into that some more, maybe it is totally about getting the government on their platform, and then that will force the rest of the country to do the same. But also, that's who has the resources usually. And even Canada has said, like, hey, our public service should lead in using this in service delivery and blah, blah, blah. And the US says the same. One of their principles is the exact same. Public sector should be leading. So again, don't necessarily need to take a nefarious lens on it. It's pretty straightforward. I don't really understand how respecting intellectual property fits into that. It was so random, but hey, I'm glad they said it. Like, good for them. Maybe they just had to throw that in there because of the past track record around IP. So, and strictly adhere to data and privacy protections. So, to the earlier debate, at least they said it. How much they're going to do it, different story. However, I was surprised to, not surprised, but it was helpful to understand this nuance, which is, we have this kind of, a lot of times you have this image that, like, China is this huge surveillance state and they could see everything and all your data and whatever. But actually, there are relatively strict regulations with respect to privacy and security in the private sector. It's more so when the government uses the data, which, to the point earlier about, like, what does the NSA do in the US? How is that any different? It's just, what lens are you looking through that? So I'm not saying I agree with it. I'm just trying to add that context of, like, there is actually some teeth to this. It's just, how much does that actually hold true when it comes to at the government uses of it? Compliant and open use of data, standard stuff. Again, not a theme that you hear come through in the US plan. is one of their top principles, conducting AI security governance, which really is just like the words you would want to hear about things like, conducting AI risk assessments, creating response measures, establishing risk testing, threat information sharing, which is kind of like standard across the board. You see that in the US plan as well. Strengthening data security. Did like to see that at least, enhancing explainability, transparency, and security. And same thing. You'll keep hearing that. But again, that is the almost exact opposite of what you see in the other plan, which is promoting international cooperation. Yeah, please. Yeah, and that's where like, oh, sorry, I should actually point it out at the beginning. I did have just like a little asterisk because of exactly that. Yeah, and typically, which is actually a really helpful resource. I think one of the articles, or at least something at the end, links to that. I think it's at Stanford. There's like the Digi China Institute or something like that. And so they have some really helpful translations. Like for instance, of the 2017 National AI Development Plan, they actually had expert linguists go through and translate it properly. That wasn't available for this, so pretty much had to use Google Translate and hope for the best. I think we got the gist though. So safety though definitely is a focus, generally in the discourse. I won't necessarily say that I saw safety all the way through, but at the very least I saw security, control, risk, and governance. Those words were definitely there. So I suspect some of it may just be mistranslation. And what is this guy again? Sorry, this was news to me too. So, but again, sticking to kind of the multilateral contract that exists today, they want to jointly implement the Global Digital Compact. Now, what is that? Commits governments to upholding international law. So we were talking about law and human rights online, and taking concrete steps to make the digital space safe and secure. Honestly, first I've heard of that. I know that most countries have a kind of initiative like that. The UN has so many different ones. It's also worth noting though that, and I'm not saying this with any kind of like, I'm not casting aspersions, but it was just an interesting perspective that I heard, which is, it is interesting to know, or to remind oneself that China also sits on the UN Security Council. So they also have a veto. So it's also probably in their best interest that they advocate using existing fora where they have that kind of pull. But not a bad thing, because then we also criticize the US when they circumvent the UN to do whatever it is they do. So at least they're saying like, hey, let's use the structures we have, which I frankly agree with, because we don't have time to build new ones. Like, just use what you have. And yeah, if you could build it on the side too while you're doing it, great, but use what you have as well. And hence adhere to the UN as the primary channel. I wonder why. And promoting inclusive, equitable, multilateral, global digital governance system, just word salad of good things though, right? And inclusive development. This part I like to see. So at least we see safe, equitable, and inclusive development. And go to the last guy here, which is strengthen international cooperation on AI capacity building, which was kind of like the whole infrastructure thing we were talking about earlier, helping the global south and calling on that moral imperative of leading countries or developed countries to help developing countries, which is, again, not something you see at all in the US plan, which is strange given their track record in the 20th century. But I guess the motives are different now. And so, or they just manifest themselves differently. Maybe they're not so different. And improving AI literacy and skills, kind of just run-of-the-mill stuff. They know that it's going to impact the workforce. They know that people are going to need to upskill in order to use these tools. So at the very least, they call it out. There's just something, and I realized after the fact, I probably should have taken out the word AI, but because it's just like took over the whole thing. But hey, I clearly don't make word clouds all the time. But it was just, because of when I read it, I'm like, it just feels so different, just the words that they use. And it was interesting, the words that pop up. Like, I mean, on the right side is the American, and of course, America, secure, power, Trump. Like, why is Trump there? But it is. Race, win. Whereas China, not that they don't have some of those words, but there's a lot more of open, cooperate, inclusive, south, joint, governance is huge, right? Standards, rights. You don't see green. You don't see any of that over there. So I thought just at a very basic way, like that's why you just feel different. Just the words that they use, the tone that they have is completely different. Ethics, safe. Yeah, no, none of that there. Allies, enemies. You don't see the word intelligent. There you go, right? So, all right. So what do we take away from this? So this is why I said at the beginning, and that's why I really want to give that context of it was just turned as like, this is a response to the US. I think you could tell by now it's clearly not. It's not that they don't have the US in mind. It was just this was planned clearly a long time before, and there's a long track record of policy before that. And that's kind of the interesting thing. So it's less of an action plan, more a call to action, but at least it follows kind of consistently from previous, Chinese, the previous stance on policy and previous policy action, which is a big change, right? In stark contrast to the US, who's kind of done almost a full 180, right? I mean, a couple years ago under Biden, it was safe, trustworthy, secure. Now it's a race for dominance and eliminating woke AI. Like these are the actual names of executive orders, right? So a clear difference in tone there, far more collaborative and inclusive. We kind of saw that in the word cloud. They don't use words like, there's no mention of a race, there's no mention of adversaries and allies, there's just humanity and the international good. And like, so very, very different, relies on existing power structures. We were just chatting about that, but that goes beyond the UN. They talk about things like ISO, where they know they don't necessarily have the leading voice, but that, this is the best avenue we have. So this is why I also don't think that they necessarily over index on like wherever China has the say. It's just like, hey, there's also just places where, yeah, we have some say, but it's probably the most, it's probably the most appropriate forum to use today. There's promising emphasis on a couple of things which we talked about, which is that public and social good, inclusivity, uplifting developing countries, which I think is huge because that's really where a lot of the public good potential for AI is, right? It's not just in particular industries that could benefit from that or delivery of services like healthcare, but it's actually entire economies that could stand to benefit because it's a lot easier to scale up digital infrastructure than it is physical infrastructure. Excuse me, not that the two are totally separate, but you can reach a lot more people that way, including things, let's say education or healthcare, to a degree, of course. And climate friendly, whereas the US is not even like there's a gradient, it's just the opposite. It's just totally not climate friendly. It's get rid of all the regulation, it's a problem. They call it that all the way through. Whereas here we're talking about climate friendly, green, sustainable, so a real difference in tone, but much more aligned with the global approach. Like out of the two, Canada's way more aligned with this style, way more aligned with this rhetoric. So I think that's quite telling. And champions open source, which again, kind of like the US, I think everybody realizes that's kind of more or less the right thing to do. However, it's worth noting that they also talk a lot about making sure things are controlled and secure. And so how exactly you balance open with controlled is a balancing act, and especially with the track record. So that remains to be seen for sure. But overall, what I noticed from just, understanding the broader context here, understanding when they did this, and just who was there at that conference too, and what they were talking about, there's clearly a notable increase in Chinese influence in the global discourse. And that's where I was just kind of alluding earlier to the fact that at this conference, you had people like Jeffrey Hinton, you had Andrew Yao, Yashua Bengio, you had the dean of Tsinghua Institute of International AI Governance, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, but anybody who works in AI or remotely in AI knows that like some of the best and brightest minds come out of that school. Also, big shout out to Sharif University in Iran, which, like, for whatever reason, produces an insane amount of ML scientists too. And yeah, so this is kind of where I just wanted to point out some of the things that they were talking about, and those dialogues with people like Hinton and Bengio resulted in concrete things. And again, how much they're going to do with that, but at least they signed to it, which is, that meeting that they had during the session actually culminated in something called the Shanghai Consensus, which warns of and makes us happy when they talk about increasing evidence suggesting that advanced future AI systems may deceive humans and escape our control. So they're clearly talking about these things, and that includes safety, assurance on frontier development, commitments to global verifiable behavior red lines. I don't know what that means, but something good. Investment in research and safe by design AI, which is great, but this is the part that I found really interesting, which is signatories include Jeffrey Hinton, Bengio, Yao. So like people who otherwise are not afraid to speak their mind. If they disagreed with this, they had I'm sure everyone here knows at least something about Jeffrey Hinton, enough to know that that man does not care. Like he's not going to say something he doesn't believe. He doesn't care who he's talking to. So the fact that he'll actually put his name and sign that says a lot. And go to China for the first time too. So that's why I kind of point that out to say that clearly there's a shift. And I guess that is it. So time for Q&A. Thank you. All right. Now we're to the Q&A. I know there was a lot of questions. I see. Yes, Savannah. Mm-hmm. No, not at all. And the truth there is that like I was speed running trying to educate myself on like what China is doing and like how this works, and I actually found this out like towards the end. That this level of detail that is. I actually didn't know that Hinton was there and Benji was there until like yesterday, and then to find this level of detail, like what they actually did there, I only found recently. So I kind of put it at the end, and I thought it would be an interesting surprise and would trigger question and answer, which it did. So it worked. But you're right. It's very momentous. Yes. The Chinese government did. Yeah. Right. And I will say like there was more of a write up on other things, and I think some of them did actually include Chinese government officials as well, or at least some of their agencies, just not this one in particular. And just for the online audience, the question there was, or the comment was, for this these signatories here, you notice that there's not any Chinese officials or agencies, and the response was one, but they're still very notable people, including who are very influential in China, including in a political way. And I just kind of mentioned in some of the other plenary sessions and outcomes there, you did actually have Chinese government officials involved. And so, yeah, thank you for that. Yes. Yes. Question. Mhm. No, that's a very good point. The question there was there any kind of either overt or maybe coded mention of Taiwan, especially given the contention over the chips issue? And short answer is no, like not even once. And now that you point that out, I realize, yeah, not at all. And I think because it's just then that would conflate something else in there and would probably make it a lot uglier, and then would make it a little bit more prickly, like for people to engage with, because then it becomes like, oh, am I picking sides? You sign up to any of that stuff, you're not picking sides. You start talking about chips and places, then it's like, oh, okay, well, are you more aligned with China or the US? Or so I suspect maybe that's why, but no, I didn't see that anywhere. Good question though. Yes, Jason. Yes.
I think the comparison to the U.S. action plan is probably not the best comparison because it's so different. It's probably better to compare this to the Paris summit agreement that they signed after, and comparing the language as well as in because this seems more like a legit, like normie, like we all love AI and we're gonna cooperate together kind of
Yeah.
thing.
Very fair point. And yeah, and you're absolutely right. They're not the same thing. That's kind of what I tried to call it right at the beginning. But I think maybe part of the focus too is just because the current sentiment, I think, is that they are similar, right? So at this point, we know, I mean, this is where I say online people, I'm not repeating that. You also got to buy tickets to come see smart people say smart things. But no, you're very right. They're not similar at all. And sorry, it was just for the online audience though. The gentleman here was saying that it would be more comparable to the Paris earlier this year. Okay.
They contain a lot of the similar language, but I think they emphasize safety less. So I'd be interested to see like comparison of the two. I'm not saying that this was good, but I'm just for future.
So we have our next talk by Jason Young, right? No, man, seriously, for real. We need some of that geopolitical perspective from you. I think I saw. Can I? Yep. Question. Great question. Question for the audience online is: what role does the Chinese government play in AI labs, frontier AI labs in China? Right. The honest answer is I don't know. It's a great question. Should look more into it. Truthfully, I honestly don't know. No. They didn't mention anything like that here. But however, I would suspect. I want to say outright no, because remember, some of these things can be done in indirect ways too, right? You can have people who are very politically aligned or very politically powerful who aren't overtly political on those boards. However, there was actually a change in tone that got called out in some of the analysis I was reading too, which is rather than only multilateral, they emphasize really heavily on multi-stakeholder engagement through the work that they do. And that's a clear change in tone because they apparently didn't really say that a lot before. And that's why they emphasize industry, academia, and government. So it sounds like they're actually trying to level the playing field a little bit more, less of like a top down, which kind of correlates with the policy eras where we are right now, where they're kind of like stepping back a bit and saying like, hey, like we get it. We need our private sector to lead here and our research and academia. And they're giving them the space to breathe to do that. So I suspect maybe they might have someone to just keep an eye, right? But it may not have to necessarily be on their board, which I don't know that's different from anywhere else, like even the US, you know? So great question though. Yes. Mm-hmm. To be fair, I think one of the earlier principles was building digital infrastructure. So that's very early on, and it is specifically about that. They just don't call out chips, and I think that's very intentionally. But at the conference, it's worth noting that they did have the expo and the trade show. Huawei was definitely there, showing off their new chips. That was directly called out. So it's there. But in terms of the document itself, they do actually call it digital infrastructure, which includes cloud, it includes data infrastructure, data centers, the electrical grid. So I think there actually is that focus there. But good question though. And I saw one more over here somewhere. I think you had a question. Not anymore. Answered it. Good. It could be a start to some things. I think it's a confirmation of existing things. But yeah, the chips was just like not part of this discussion at all. They don't mention it once, and I think again that's very intentionally. But everything else, it's either new or it's just a lot of it is really just continuing or furthering an existing thread of dialogue that they have going, or discourse. Sorry. Yes. Yeah. Mhm. It is. I cannot repeat that for the online audience, I'll be honest with you. But no, but thank you for that context. And again, online audience, that's a reason to buy a ticket and show up to hear smart people say smart things, not just us. No, but thank you for that comment. That's interesting context. Uh, any other questions, comments? Because eventually we'll also break out into our own little groups. But yes, Savannah. No, that's a great point. Yeah, because the military and defense was like a huge thread in the USAA action plan. Defense is everywhere. Everything that every agency is going to do, the Department of Defense, the gentleman was just asking about like, will there be board members? So apparently the Department of Defense in the US is going to sit everywhere and anywhere and tell them what to do. So yeah, that's a very good point. Nothing is mentioned here about military. Not that, of course, it's not clearly something that they're trying to apply, like any sane country probably should be doing, especially in this kind of issue that they're in. But yeah, no mention of defense, no mention of military. Good point. And yes, saw you there. Mm. Not that are directly related to this. There are no shortage of documents that pre-exist it, and I'm sure that will exist after the fact as well, and perhaps even documentation that came out of those sessions. But no, and also because I don't think this is like It's an action plan. It's a call to action, right? As I'm sure probably would have come out of the Paris summit, something like that, like a commitment to things, right? But not necessarily like technical guidelines and everything else to go with it. So no, I think that's a different flavor. But other things that support it, and I'm sure that will flow from it as well. Yes, Wyatt. No, you're next.
So it does seem like in terms of the overall pattern of international governments, this is a step forward in the sense that the Paris summit was a step backwards. That's when JD asked me before. It said we're going to build on regulate and
Right.
follow suit. So I think there's at least a step back towards governance, which is a big win. The other thing that sticks out too is obviously given China's history, it's very, very good that they are saying this, but they're clearly not the best spokesperson for it. So I wouldn't be surprised if, like, and full disclosure, we're kind of pushing Canada to lead in global AI governance. So I think other countries are probably more better placed to have really talking this talk and walk the walk. But it's good to know that they are open to this and be willing to talk about it. That's, I think, is generally a good development.
I would agree, and that's kind of my position as well. So I'm glad you said that. I'm very much of the opinion that Canada should be leading the four, because we clearly can't lead in terms of things like physical infrastructure, development of that, and that's just something we got to wear and definitely fix. But what we do have a good track record of doing, especially as a middle power, is playing that role of convening people, because we're not out there saber rattling and beating our chest. Who's coordinating the AI safety institutes? Sounds like something we could probably do. And so yeah, I'm very much on board with that. I'm very biased in that way. But yeah, I agree. And yes, so to that end, and I actually forgot about that. You're right about the whole JD Vance, tone back earlier in the year, saying like, yeah, no, we're just gonna go full speed. Regulation's bad. Blah blah blah. Very total opposite. So yes, bringing some semblance of sanity back to the global discourse. Good point. Thank you, China. Yes.
So, could you put in 25 words or less what this is a call to action to? What would it be?
Stop. Stop waiting for the U.S. to come save you. I'm being serious. But seriously, stop waiting for the U.S. to come save you, because they're not coming to save you. They're not even going to save their own people. So we need to fix this, right? There is a global vacuum of power. There's a global vacuum of leadership, more importantly. What are we going to do about that? Sorry.
I honestly don't know if like this document is like almost like a continuation of like fluffy, like feel good, like bullshit, or if it is a actual deliberate attempt at making statements behind like non-concrete actions. I don't know which one it is, because if you compare it, it is not really a plan, but if you compare this to the U.S. plan, the U.S. plan is a plan. Like they're in it to win it, and it's very clear, and there's a deterrence effect from the plan. This one, it's not really clear what China's goals are, other than to continue this internationalism that the U.S. has given up, and internationalism. But the end of this internationalism is not apparent to me that it's beneficial for her.
No. That's what this is for. And I think we're getting to that stage, so we'll probably break out for individual discussions or smaller group discussions soon. But I think I saw one or two more hands. Or we've cleared them all. Cool. So, just had to be that person. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The National AI Development Plan. Yeah.
Did it have the same emphasis on internationalism, like specifically that this does?
No. Not at all. It was a much more lengthy document, much more akin to the kind of US AI action plan, but actually with a lot more detail in it, about like what's going to happen when, how much, and all that kind of stuff. But no, not as much the focus on internationalism. I'll be honest, I didn't read like line for line everything, but from my understanding, my skim of it as well, no, not that focus there. Especially because at that time too, China was a lot more, not necessarily inward looking, but inward looking in terms of its international stance. Like, we're going to work with who we want to work with. We're not trying to lead the world. All right, but the US was also in a very different place then too. And I think that brings us to a close of the main Q&A. So yes, please do stick around until, as Mario would say, until he's ready to kick you out. And I think Mario's actually, you're going to come close, right? Right? You're going to come make a plug or two, and then we stick around, finish the pizza, have something to drink, and yeah. But wait, I'm just kidding. I just want to say thanks. No, but thank you all very much for coming, attending, listening so attentively, and asking some awesome questions. Like, I like being stumped. I come here so I can get smarter. I hope that this helped, shed some perspective on something that's not necessarily talked about in this way, at least not from what I could find. But yeah, please do continue to come, and that's more Mario's job to encourage you to do that. So over to you, sir.
Thanks again, Ajay. By the way, Jason is actually giving a presentation on the first Tuesday of September. If you go to that QR code on the left, you can find events there. So that's a real presentation upcoming. Yeah, if you want to keep posted our events, use a QR code on the right. If you want to keep in contact with us on Slack, AIGS Canada has a Canada-wide Slack for people interested in AI safety. There's a Trajectory Labs channel in there you can find. And yeah, you're welcome to stick around. Thanks so much for joining us.